According to Faith Goldie, Canadian far-right activist who recently ran for mayor in her hometown of Toronto, where she received 3.4% of the votes, Antifa, quote, hates the West, borders, legal immigrants, everything about the way the West was formed, free markets, private property, God, and the innocence of children, end quote. Is this view correct? Various intellectuals have defended the Antifa and its use of violence. Historian Mark Bray calls it, quote, organized collective self-defense and an all too necessary response to the threat caused by white nationalists and fascists. According to Alexander Reed Ross, lecturer in geography at Portland State University and author of a book on the contemporary right, Antifa is, quote, one of the best models for channeling the popular reflexes and spontaneous movements towards confronting fascism in organized and focused ways, end quote. For Eleanor Penny, who writes about fascism and the far right, quote, physical resistance has time and again protected local populations from racist violence and prevented a gathering caucus of fascists from making further inroads into mainstream politics, end quote. Antifa, which of course stands for anti-fascist, consists of various leftist and often anarchist groups. The name Antifa has been in use in Germany since the early 1930s. During the Nazi era, they went underground, but in 1944, as the Nazis were losing the war, local anti-fascist committees, who called themselves Antifa, were founded in various German cities, consisting mainly of communists, social democrats and left-leaning Christians. After the war, the Antifa groups in East Germany were absorbed into the new Stalinist state, and the name was used for various state organizations. The Berlin Wall, which was built in 1961, was called the Anti-Fascist Protection Wall in the East. In West Germany, Antifa lost in importance during the decades following the end of the war. It was refounded in the late 1980s, taking its inspiration from late 1960s and early 70s student movements, and was made up of anti-authoritarian, or so they thought at least, communists and anarchists. Most local groups were founded after the German reunion in the early 90s. The activists were consciously seeking out nationalists with the aim of starting fights, and they were often rioting on May the 1st, the Labor Day. They later split up into three fractions due to different views with regards to Israel, pro, con, or indifferent. And the nationwide Antifa organization fell apart into a number of small groups. They defend the use of violence not just against right-wing extremists, but also against police, clergymen, judges, and what they perceive as capitalists. Since 2010, they have been trying to block the annual marches in Dresden in early February in remembrance of the Allied firebombing at the end of the war. In 2016, on October the 3rd, Germany's national holiday in remembrance of its reunification, the Dresden Antifa campaigned for what they called, quote, Einheitsfeierlichkeiten zum Desaster machen, end quote, meaning turning reunification celebrations into a disaster, thus publicly affirming the use of violence. They use slogans like Nie wieder Deutschland, meaning Germany never again, and Deutschland verrecke, meaning die Germany. Peter Helmes, writing for the online magazine Die Unbestechlichen, meaning the Untouchables, in April 2018, explains the federal government's program Living Democracy, Opposing Right-Wing Extremism, Violence and Enmity Towards People, which was started in January 2015 under the auspices of the so-called Federal Ministry of Family Affairs, Elderly People, Women and Youths, but not of straight white men. with the aim of promoting, quote, non-militant activism and democratic behavior, end quote. The program funds organizations and initiatives that combat anti-Semitism, enmity towards Islam and Muslims, towards Roma and Sinti, and towards homosexuals and trans people, as well as racism and racist discrimination. For 2017, the program was promised a budget of 104.5 million euros by the Federal Ministry, of which 95.8 million euros were actually spent. Funding for the Antifa is not even included in this sum. The local authority districts decide themselves how to spend the money. Among the organizations that received funding were Turkish associations and a multitude of initiatives to promote homosexual and trans identity. One of the biggest receivers was the Amadeo Antonio Stiftung, founded in 1998 with the aim of combating anti-Semitism, racism and right-wing extremism. Its founder, Aneta Kahane, is a former Stasi official. The foundation supports more than 1,000 local initiatives related to youth culture, schools, victim support, refugee support, projects to promote democracy, as well as support for people leaving the neo-Nazi scene. Common criticism of the foundation is that it promotes censorship of social media while spreading information that aims at defaming moderate conservative organizations like the party, the CDU. According to the federal government, the institute is combating all forms of extremism. However, there is no support for initiatives against Islamism or the Antifa. In 2017, the federal government funded a conference on left-wing extremism with 29,000 euros. That's what the German government does to protect its citizens against violence and property destruction by the Antifa, in spite of all the violence connected to the G20 Hamburg summit in July 2017. During the summit alone, 832 far-left violent incidents occurred and more than 320 police officers were injured when the Antifa burned cars, destroyed car windows and vandalized the center of Hamburg. Eyewitnesses described it as coming close to a civil war. The damages caused amounted to billions of euros. However, the Greens, the left-wing party and the Social Democratic Party here in Germany still to this day support the movement. The German Antifa too receives money from the federal government for organizing and traveling to demonstrations and for disturbing AfD events. An Austrian member is reported to have received nearly 500 euros for one single trip, including extra charge for night travel and for journeying abroad. Here in Munich, the local Antifa group received more than 100,000 euros in 2017 alone. The activists arrive in buses, often drunk and high on drugs, and they have one aim: to cause as much violence and destruction as possible. In Sweden, anti-fascist organizations were founded in the early 1990s. The biggest one, Anti-Fascistisk Aktion, or AFA, a far-left network which coordinates activities between local groups, opposes, quote, fascism in all its forms, end quote, sexism, racism and classism. They are part of an autonomous subculture and their activities consist in handing out flyers, organizing demonstrations and indirect action, including destruction of property. They advocate violence against neo-Nazis, but they have also been threatening the subscribers of right-wing newspapers, and there have been cases of assaults on moderate conservatives. As distinguished from their German and US colleagues, the Swedish Antifa tolerates no diversity of view, and they not only exclude but have occasionally even been assaulting moderate leftists. This has led to accusations of hostility towards free speech in the Swedish media, as if free speech didn't extend to the far right also. The Swedish Antifa has been involved in arson by timed firebombs, attacks on immigration offices, threatening the officials, The smashing of windows of center-leaning political parties like the Christian Democrats in Sweden, threats to block council meetings and threats towards individual council members, an attack on an immigration judge, destroying his front door with an axe and vandalizing his house with red spray paint, and public calls for attacks on individual opponents, distributing names and images of the victims. AFA works with other so-called anti-racist groups all over Europe. In the US, extreme leftists, many of whom identified as Maoists, started to assault Ku Klux Klan members in the late 70s. In the US and Canada, many Antifa groups were formed around 2010 in response to what they perceived as a growing nationalism, and they have grown and become more and more active throughout the decade, especially since the 2016 presidential election. In fact, the name Antifa only came into prominence last year in the US. It was borrowed from the German groups. The US Antifa consists of autonomous, anti-capitalist, militant groups made up of anarchists, communists and socialists, as well as some social democrats and left-leaning liberals. They engage in direct action, including online protesting, disturbing far-right meetings with the aim of deplatforming their opponents, property damage including smashing windows and slashing car tires. They also physically attack far-right people and even the police, occasionally using sticks and Molotov cocktails. As you can see on a video she uploaded on her channel this spring, Faith Goldie was herself attacked by Antifa activists who beat her, spat on her and tried to destroy her phone. In addition, activists tried to destroy opponents' personal lives by having them fired from their jobs and losing their apartments. Earlier this month, Antifa activists gathered in the night outside the home of Tucker Carlson on Fox News, screaming, quote, "Tucker Carlson, we will fight, we know where you sleep at night," end quote, and defacing his driveway with spray paint. There is no formal organization or membership. The groups form loose support networks or operate independently. According to Brian Levin, director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University in San Bernardino, Antifa activists believe that elites are controlling the government and the media, which they think justifies their actions, including the use of violence. Antifa organizer Scott Crow has said that they aim at causing conflict, that far-right people, he mentions Nazis and fascists, quote, "of any stripe," end quote, should have no freedom of speech, and that property destruction is not a form of violence. According to the US Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, anarchist extremists are the primary instigators of violence at public rallies against a range of targets. The Department of Homeland Security calls this domestic terrorism. Jesse Areguin, the mayor of Berkeley, wants to classify the city's Antifa as a gang. Laura Ingraham, contributor to Fox News, has labeled Antifa a terrorist organization, and the same has been suggested by AfD top politician Alice Weidel here in Germany. In the next video we will have a look at anarcho-capitalist / conservative YouTuber Stefan Molyneux's views on the Antifa, the experiences and views of a former Antifa activist, as well as what identitarian front figure Martin Sellner has to say on the subject.